something we had to explain to Sima Wali, our Afghan partner and friend, who was the first refugee to come to this country in 1978, hosted by Theodore Elliott, by the way, the ambassador. And what we had to explain to her when we first met her in 1998, she said, after 10 years, the Soviets have gone. Why is it worse in Afghanistan? This was before the rise of the Taliban. This would have been in 1998. And we had to tell her, your country was never meant to be saved. It was never meant to be given back to you. This is the truth, okay? And the Taliban, in fact, Chuck Kogan referred to the Taliban of a wholly owned subsidiary of Pakistani intelligence. And Pakistani intelligence was created by British intelligence. And when you begin to see the pan-Islamism of the British agenda from the 19th century is still living.
We do the like ants in a colony, organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to Subversive History. My name is Pat, and this is my co-host, Johnny. Today, we are joined by Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, a husband and wife team of journalists who have been covering the political situation in Afghanistan since the late 1970s. They have produced documentaries such as Afghanistan Between Three Worlds and Arms Race and the Economy, A Delicate Balance. They have also authored multiple books on the subject, including Crossing Zero and the subject of today's interview, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. Their work has been praised by the likes of Noam Chomsky and Oliver Stone, and we could not be more grateful that they have taken the time to speak with us today. Paul and Liz, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for asking us. It's great to be here with you.
Yes.
Before getting into the specifics of your book, I thought it would be, helpful to get a little bit of a more personal introduction. This is the first time that we've ever had a husband and wife team that we're interviewing that has written books together on historical topics, political topics. What is the background of that? Because it's not particularly usual in the space.
Well, we do have a kind of unusual background story. There's no question about it.
Yeah, well, we actually, we first met when Paul was actually a singer, and he had gotten the lead in the Boston production of Hair, which was a very, very, very popular Broadway musical. It was an American love rock musical. That's what they termed it.
It was on Broadway, and they did a Boston production. They had productions all over the world, actually.
So I ended up knowing a lot of people in the cast. That's how I met him, because he was, I was invited to the previews. And so that was in 1970. And it was the era of the Vietnam War. And one of the reasons that that Hair was important was because Hair was really carrying the anti-war movement at a profound level for our generation. The boomers were the ones. We didn't just experience, the JFK assassination, but we also experienced this incredibly powerful idea of believing we had stopped the Vietnam War and we had kind of felt we ended war. I think we learned a lesson about what we really did, but that's why we ended up in the work that came along, that led to it. And as we started working on documentaries, that actually was the result of being aware of the political situation in our area, because Paul's cousin is Ed Markey. And at the time, he was running for in 1976, the first Congress, for his first run at Congress. And when he did get elected, we became very involved with the political scene. Well, Jimmy Carter got elected on basically a peace movement, effectively. It was going to be détente. It was going to be the end of the reign of what was known even back then as the neocons and the endless war agenda. Because the Vietnam War had so decimated the economy, we were actually going to get reinvestment in Main Street. Well, something weird happened along the way. In 1979, the Soviet Union crossed the border into Afghanistan, and suddenly we literally witnessed, as we had talk to people like John Galbraith about the economic impact of the arms race on the economy, and Paul Warnke, who negotiated the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, how important it was. Well, it seemed as if magically the idea of peace and negotiation and détente vanished. And this was the Democrats we're talking about now. So we felt a very odd phenomenon. And within days, Jimmy Carter referred to it as the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. And once again, it's like, what just happened? How does crossing into a tiny country like Afghanistan suddenly become the greatest, from, by the way, a country in the Soviet Union that was considered in its sphere of influence? That's what the US had done to Afghanistan post-World War II with the creation of Pakistan. So there were just a lot of bits of questions that were raised. So that kind of set us up.
So that's how we got into it. I had a show when I decided that, that singing was not, I had been a freshman at Boston University. I was going to be a journalist, and I just happened, it was on a lark that I saw an article in the newspaper, and I was a singer. I'd been in bands. I'd been in the Boston Opera Company, and I just happened to see that they were holding these auditions. So I said, I had 3 weeks at Christmas vacation. I said, I'll go down and audition just to see what happens. And they wound up giving me the lead. So it was just one of those crazy things that happened. And I got a whole new view of the world. I met Liz, and I kind of, it was also, interestingly enough, it was the very same day that I did the audition. My faculty advisor had called me to his apartment, and I was a freshman, first semester, and he says, have you ever considered working for your government? And I thought it was based on the things that I had been writing, when I was a freshman in the English class. And I said, no, I hadn't really. And so he said, well, you really should seriously consider this. There's many things you can do. He says, you're not against the American government's involvement in the world, are you? And I said, not particularly, not today anyway.
Way to phrase it.
So he said, well, what about the Vietnam War? I said, I don't think we're going to win it. So this was in 1970. We'd already lost it at that point. But the fact is that, so he, and so strangely enough, about 2 months later, I was walking down Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. I was still registered as a student at BU while I was doing the show. And I ran into this English teacher that I had. And he said, I read that article about you in the paper the other day. And he said, I could have sworn you were a nihilist. And I thought to myself, he's the guy. He's the recruiter. He was the one who set me up to go and meet the faculty advisor, who was then the second step in this process of recruitment. So, so anyway, so I kind of stayed away from that. I got called by New York, the same people that did Hair were doing Jesus Christ Superstar 2 years later. So I got called down, and I did that for a few months and sent on the road as Jesus and whatnot. And then just really decided, I said, I got to go back. I got to think about what's going on here. I got to make a decision. So I kind of went back. I gravitated back towards writing and the news coverage, and I really liked the politics about this stuff. And I started working with some local politicians who turned out to be very powerful people. And then my cousin decided to run for Congress in '76. So I said, well, that's it. I'm in now. So at any rate, so I found a job on the local television station and had a talk show there for 3 years. And that's when they were running this thing called the SALT syndrome. And the SALT syndrome was put out by this American Security Council, which is kind of like the origin core group of defense manufacturers that put out this, whatever you said against a war here, they'd put out a hit team to go and, put on TV. They'll put people all over the place.
PragerU of its time.
Yeah, exactly. They blanket the media with pro-war stuff. So at any rate, so they were airing this documentary 3 times a day. So I said, look, we got to do something about this. This is public affairs. We have the equal time provision. You've got to talk about the other side of the issue. So I used some of my political connections at that point back in 1979, and we put this documentary together, The Arms Race and the Economy. And, and so what was interesting, and then the Soviets go and invade Afghanistan. And we talked to all these people. I mean, Paul Warnke had negotiated for years with the Soviets. And John Galbraith had run the U.S. economy back during World War II. And it's kind of like, the good guys just kind of rolled over to this new agenda. So both Liz and I said, this just doesn't smell right. So at any rate, the opportunity came up to talk to the Afghans about what they wanted out of the war. They had an embassy at the United Nations. And so we went down and we talked to them, and we met a very enterprising, he was a charge at that particular point, but eventually became the ambassador from Afghanistan to the United Nations. And I told him what we wanted to do. I said, nobody's telling your story. You're not letting anybody in there. And I said, so if it's a big black hole, then they can say anything they want about what you're trying to do. So what is really going on? I said, you let me bring a crew in, you let us bring a crew in, and we'll tell our story and what we see. So they accepted that, but it took 6 months in order to get permission to go in. It was very complicated. They had 75,000 Soviet troops there. They had to obviously get permission from them to open up. And so at any rate, so we were the first ones to go in. So needless to say, I called up a friend who worked at a local TV station. I said, I've got this permission to go into Afghanistan. Nobody else can get in. What should I do? So she said, give me 15 minutes and I'll see who's interested. She called me back in about 5 minutes and she said, everybody wants it, but CBS wants you in New York right now. So it was like, and it was Dan Rather and Bob Schieffer, and it was the guys who had covered the JFK assassination. Needless to say, the Dallas crew who would cover the JFK assassination, which would eventually, they were convinced that I had come down there to use Afghanistan to get even with Dan Rather for what they did on November 22nd. It was like, what the heck has this got to do with me, right?
Well,
So
I'd like to interject one quick point. There are people out there today who actually don't know that the Fitzgerald name, it was the F in JFK. And that is something that we have discovered to our shock, that there are people who actually don't know that.
It turns out that my grandfather and his grandfather were related. They were cousins, and back in the old country.
Nice.
So my grandfather didn't get here until 1900, and his grandfather got here. His great grandfather got here a long time before that. So, at any rate, Fitzgerald family is a very large family in Ireland. It's a very common name there, but there's a distinction. It's really not an Irish name at all. In fact, a lot of names that you'd think were Irish are Irish. They're actually Norman French. Fitz is Norman French for son of Gerald. Okay, and that goes back, and they really didn't get to Ireland until 1170. And there are all kinds of stories behind that one, but they became more Irish than the Irish. And so they were known for it.
Well, starting off as Norman invaders. So they were invaders in 1169, and they became what was known as more Irish than the Irish by the 16th century, when the Elizabethans committed a genocide basically against the Fitzgeralds that ended their reign.
They were the largest. They had, by the 16th century, they were the largest landowners in Ireland and the most powerful. They were the largest. They were the largest lords of any English lords. So, and they were considered the English. The Old English is what the Irish referred to the Fitzgeralds as. And so that was in the 16th century, and they fought numerous wars over the years for their own independence and to keep Ireland independent from the crown. And ultimately, they were completely devastated by that. The Desmond Munsters, the Desmond Fitzgerald, which is in Munster, and so that was the Leinster Fitzgeralds. Kildare up around Dublin was a different group. They'd made their own separate peace with London. But the Fitzgeralds from Southern Ireland, where my family comes from, in fact, we still have a farm there. They went all out against them and crushed the earldom. So we have a reputation with the English.
Quite.
Could I ask one thing? It's almost like the term maktub, right? As it is written, right? That like. You seem to have this sort of like funnel with your family history, with like the recruiter, with that whole situation that you should come out like, praising the war, that like you would be supporting the like the invasion or something. What led to this sort of this sympathy that you have for like the people of Afghanistan? Because I feel like most people at that time probably would not have even been that aware of like where Afghanistan is on a map, or the people of Afghanistan. Like, can I ask like what inspired this sort of like sympathy, or this interest to such a degree?
Well, I think this is simply the way we approach people. It was very personal. We, in fact, when we first sat down with the Charge in the United Nations, the real presentation was about. There's a lot of speculation about what the Soviets are up to and what involvement the U.S. may really have in other countries, but there is nobody representing the voice of the Afghan people. So that was, in fact, our appeal to the Afghans, that we wanted to represent that voice. And of course, in very typical fashion, when you get on the ground in Afghanistan, this would have been in 1981, in the spring of 1981, and this was actually right after Dan. It was not long after Dan Rather had done a Columbia journalism.
No. He had done a coast-to-coast broadcast.
Right, coast-to-coast broadcast,
Yeah.
right. And
Columbia Journalism Review actually wrote an article about it.
Right, and that was the point I did want to make, was that he had come out with a whole story about what was going on in Afghanistan, and Columbia Journalism Review analyzed his story as sort of setting up a sudden shutdown of the sort of an openness that had been observed preceding it. It was almost as if something happened, something shifted. Okay, and we have no idea,
Well, what's interesting is that they pointed out in this article that he had taken the lead he'd been pushed into the lead on this issue, similar to the way he'd been pushed into the lead on the JFK assassination. That he really had, he'd pushed the lone gunman thing, and they went. Of course, they've discovered now that that when they processed the film, they'd flip those two slides around, those two frames rather, in the film, so that it looked as if JFK had gone in one direction and not the other. He'd been forced forward and not to the back and to the left. That he'd been shot and went down to the right. So so they'd flipped it around. They'd played with it in the basic the kind of special effects that they had back in 1963. They kind of imposed those on it. So
This
the fact
Zapruder
that
film, you mean, right?
Sorry, what?
The Zapruder film.
Yes, there's a Zapruder film. But you see, nobody else saw it. Dan Rather was the guy who was allowed to view it for the American audience. And then on the news, he basically duplicated what he had seen in that. And so, as I mentioned to you, by the time we got to CBS News, they were convinced that as a Fitzgerald, they knew who the Fitzgeralds were. And they said, as a Fitzgerald, that I had come to get even with Dan. And as a matter of fact, I was on my way to the airport. It was the last phone call that came in. I'm sitting with the foreign editor, and the phone rings. And so he looks at me, he says, "It's all right, you're cleared to go." He said, "But if you're doing this to get Dan, I'll get you." Yeah, that's how I left New York. Isn't that terrific, huh? So at any rate, it's like, oh boy, here we go. So so I had a crew. I had to pull a crew together quickly. I pulled a couple of local people from Boston with me, and I don't think they really knew what was going on. For them, this was a kind of whole new type of thing that was happening, and we had a kind of budding video community in Boston at the time that I was connected to at MIT, and so at any rate, so it worked out fine. I mean, it turned out the cameraman was rock steady. He was very good. He was a local guy. He liked to climb mountains. He was about 5'4" or something, but he was a rock. So at any rate, he gave us some great video and covered the whole thing. We got it back, and so the foreign editor says to me, he says, "There's not much there." I said, "I got you an interview with the Soviet-installed president of Afghanistan. I got you the foreign minister." I said, "I got 7 days worth of footage around town, everything else." He says, "Well, yeah, but you didn't shoot MiGs at the air base. You didn't do this. You didn't do this." And I'm saying, at any rate, it was a war zone, needless to say. I mean, you get caught shooting things you're not supposed to shoot, they shoot you. So, and I reminded him of that. I said, that's not what I went there for. I said, that's not exactly what I went there for. As it turned out, the cameraman had turned the camera on at the airport. And we went to a couple of military airports, and he had kind of like slid the camera around on a couple of occasions and shown the hundreds and hundreds of of MiGs and helicopters that they had there. But that was no surprise. I mean, I'm sure they had plenty of pictures of that from satellite photos at Langley. But the fact is that anyway, the story I wanted to tell was the story that we wanted to tell was the story of Afghan, what were the Afghans doing? The Afghan women that were being taught, the schools that they had. And, right up until just a few years ago, the New York Times published an editorial, an obituary rather, for a friend of ours that we'd been back to Afghanistan with after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. And they put out the fact that the communists had suppressed women. And it's like, we emailed the guy and said, the communists aren't the ones that suppressed women. The people we were supporting, the United States was supporting.
In fact, in the 1970s, before the eventual invasion by the Soviets, something like 60% of the students at Kabul University were women. That gives you an idea of how things are going in terms of this whole women's issue of education. And that is exactly what ultimately what the Taliban ended when they took over in 1996. So to see the New York Times put out this notice, you say, and we tried to get it corrected, and of course they wouldn't correct it.
He said, no, I'm not changing it. No. He said they both did it. The Taliban did it and the communists did it. So I said, well, what's the point of arguing with you about that? I mean, it's just so wrong. And once again, you realize that, I needed to get there and see for myself what was really going on, because I needed to as much, see what they were doing as I did see what we were doing here in the United States with our media, because of what we'd experienced with arms race and the economy. Yeah. And it's like you come to a diametrically opposed point of view with your own system. And, it was kind of what, ironically, had I not done that audition that day in 1969, in December of was like the 23rd or the 22nd of December, my last day of my first semester, and I had listened to just my faculty advisor, I probably would have wound up in Afghanistan with somebody else. Let's put it that way. And the fact is that I was very suspicious of what he did, and I, it was just the way I went about doing things. And in fact, I kept getting asked I get asked by someone at Tufts University that runs the Fletcher School at one point, would I like to come in? He said to me, he said, I don't know what you do there. He said, but I think I've seen some of your TV shows. I'd really like to see, you're very provocative in terms of what you do, which is what the guy at BU had told me. You're very provocative. So he said, you look at it from a very different way. So I like that. I like that stuff. So anyway, so it's like, and I'd played football, and I could have played football at BU, and it's like, I like the rough stuff, the rough and tumble, it didn't bother me. Let's put it that way. And, I said, well, here I go into my adult years. And I said, do I really want to repeat that sort of thing? It was kind of like, and I did that in high school. I don't really want to repeat it in college, and I don't really want to, make a life out of, being the tough guy. So, I just said, well, we'll wait and see what's going on. So at any rate, I think that's, and of course, that changed my life. If I did hair, I met Liz, my course changed, the influence of people. I was getting shuttled to New York to meet all kinds of, theater people and movie people. And, it was like a whole, always say, so this is what the world's really all about. So
yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, it's another aspect of it, a slice of a different reality.
So, I'm sorry. Did you want to go, Liz?
No. You,
So I think what you had just brought up there is a theme and a subject that's central to your book and for understanding the development in Afghanistan. And it's kind of a two-part question because you brought up in the 70s the progressivism of Afghanistan. And I think many people, especially in today's generation, would view Afghanistan as this place that's been just historically backward and, I guess to use the word primitive, like all of these kind of erroneous views of Afghan civilization throughout history. Could you maybe describe how progressive Afghanistan was and how external elements promoted these more radical elements that people today view as endemic to Afghanistan culture, Afghan culture?
I like to start with one historical fact that usually sets most people in a shock mode who've heard nothing. Afghan women were given the right to vote in their constitution in 1923 by King Amanullah. American women had to beg for that right. Afghan women were given that right.
And they were a Muslim country at this point as well. Like I just wanted to point that out as well. That this is still a Muslim society at this point that is also very progressive.
And Shia mostly,
right? But
at the time.
But they were basic. But that was secular. The country was not basically a religious country. It was not like what Pakistan became and what or Israel even became.
Right.
So that's another thing. It became a religious state with the rise of the Taliban in 1996, which then began to take women's rights away 100%. The tragedy about all of this, and this is obviously what our story really recognized, quite frankly, all along the way, was that Afghanistan was being set up. Afghanistan was a tragic example of imperial, efforts.
Hubris.
You're right. Okay, and the U.S. was there to basically use Afghanistan as an effort to try to win the Cold War against the Soviet Union. In fact, the mantra out of Washington was give Russia its own Vietnam. That was what they hoped to create with Afghanistan. And the whole idea that the Soviets invaded this country and that the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, were there representing the people of Afghanistan who were offended at the Soviet involvement with some Afghans. And it was a marginal socialist state. It really was not a major communist state. In fact, the Soviets really didn't recognize them as a very advanced communist state of any kind. But so what you had though was a natural democratic process that had evolved from the 19th century. In fact, the Afghan people were known as incredibly welcoming. They had long before
that. Yeah.
But in the 19th century, when the British came through the British East India Company and all of those adventures, many Westerners were coming in and discovering this country had no fear of Christians and foreigners, basically. They also had a reputation for being incredibly powerful warriors, and that that was part of the reputation. Of course, when the British did try to take over Afghanistan in the 19th century, they really couldn't do it. And so Afghanistan became this kind of a victim, really, of the imperial moves of Russia that were coming down from the north and the British moving up from India. And so they really became this sort of buffer zone.
That was the great game.
Yeah.
Right.
So the great game for Central Asia. And that's why it was, an Afghan we met described Afghanistan as the belly button of Central Asia. So in order to control it, you had to take over Afghanistan. And so that's what the British were pushing up from the south, as Liz said. But the fact is that, that had been going on. The whole British thing, the British went in and they set up the system whereby they would buy off the most radical anti-modernist mullahs. And those were the ones that made it, they'd set them up in London, they'd bring them to London, they'd cater to them just the way they did in the Middle East with the House of Saud. They found a group of Arabs that they could work with and for their agenda, and then they just bought them off, essentially. And the United States at the end of World War II picked up a lot of that. They picked up the practice and they picked up the people, but they didn't really have the background and the understanding. And that's what we kept running into. We kept running into the fact that the Americans really, they were kind of not aware of the deeper background in this whole kind of thing. And what was interesting was at one point, when our second book came out, Crossing Zero, we got asked to speak at the Naval Postgraduate School, and in San Francisco, Monterey, to advise people that were going in. I mean, they were going in. They'd been there since 2002. They knew they weren't getting anywhere about it. And it's funny. We had heard years before that the Navy just didn't do mountains. But apparently by 2011, the Navy was doing mountains, and they wanted to hear the real story as to how you deal with this situation. What do you have to do? The same questions you're asking. Why do we understand it and nobody else could understand it? And it was just once again laying back and let them tell their own story. Let them write their narrative and tell us what you mean. And so we came to believe these people are fierce. And when they tell you something, that's the truth. They're not lying to you. And so the fact is that that's what we learned about the Afghans is that they were fierce and reliable, and that you would want them as your friends, not as your enemies. And so, if you're talking to a soldier about what am I up against, I'd say, go fight somebody else.
I do want to make a point, though, about the warrior reputation of the Afghans, which they actually really ended up trapped in. Because part of the way in which the Mujahideen and ultimately the Taliban were viewed was this ultimate warrior class. Well, that's not the warrior class that was the Afghan people. In
Right.
fact, I want to tell you a story about a very, very incredible Bachir Khan. Was he created he was a leader in the areas in Pakistan. This would have been in the 1920s, after they were between Afghanistan and India. There was an area before it became Pakistan. This would have been the areas that the Pashtuns were living in, and it was brutal. The British ruled this brutally, and so over time, Bachir Khan created basically a peace movement among the warriors of Afghanistan. And the reason they had to do it, it's really quite an interesting story, was because they have what's called Pashtunwali. It's a code of living that has been in existence for 5,000 years. And by the way, much more important than the Islamic code to them is the Pashtunwali code. One of the things they had in the code was the right, under certain circumstances, to kill someone. If somebody causes some kind of crisis, you do have, the ability, bloodletting is allowed. Well, that, existed for 5,000 years. Well, apparently when they were living in these areas ruled by the British, the amount of infighting got so horrible, they were killing each other. So Bachir Khan's idea was to try to refocus that warrior energy. And this is again in the 1920s, and put it into a peace movement. And so that's what he created in 1928. And this peace movement became so popular, he had 100,000, they call them soldiers. They were the soldiers of peace now, though. And by the way, women were in the movement too, not just men.
And that's another thing about Afghanistan, by the way, that people today American aid workers simply did not understand. When we went back in 2002 with Seema Wali, who was a member of the royal family, and she was trying to tell the women that she was working with, from other countries, that you can't teach the women in the same classes as you teach the men. And she said, no, this is Afghanistan. The women and the men don't have that problem in Afghanistan. The men respect the women's right to be with them at all times. And so you'd see the women down by the riverbank as you drove through Kabul, washing clothes, and it was just it was an incredible experience. And this was still in 2002. So the fact is that those kinds of things, just the lack of just any kind of subtlety or nuance about what the Afghan people were really all about, that if you understood their culture, that even, as I said, professional aid people didn't understand the culture that they were going in to try to assist, with genuine, with serious, reasons to want to help them. And so anyway, that's was just another one of the enigmas of dealing with it. It's like everything they tried to do. And so what it wound up being is that, the United States military wound up involving itself with the Taliban. And the Taliban, when we came out with Crossing Zero in 2011, we actually was in 2009, actually. We were visited by at Harvard by Chuck Cogan. He was the guy who ran the operation Cyclone, I believe it was called, for 5 years out of the CIA. He was the chief of the Directorate of Operations for Near East and South Asia. And he came and we did our spiel, and he said, I agree with you guys. He said, what you did, he said, and the fact that the Russians didn't want to really invade. He said, but the idea that, that Zbigniew Brzezinski lured them in. He said, I ran that operation for 5 years. And
you quote it in the book. He literally says it in multiple ways and multiple instances, says essentially that exact thing, right? I just was reading the book yesterday. I'm pretty sure he says it in pretty explicit
We need to give the Soviets their own Vietnam.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what Liz had told him. And he said, I don't buy that. He said, I ran the operation. It just doesn't work that way. So then anyway, so a few years went by, and Liz and I talked it over, and we said, we got to interview him. He's getting old, and we'd love to just bring a camera over and see what he thought about this thing, right? So he was in Harvard Square, and so we went over to see him, very erudite, he's a Francophile. He spoke French fluently. He had been apparently somebody appointed him ambassador to Paris at one point. So it's like, very sophisticated guy. So anyway, so he agreed. Liz called him up on the phone. She said, can we come over and interview? Oh, yeah, I'll set you up in my living room. So we went over one Saturday morning, and we spent the afternoon with him. We set up the camera. And so I'm throwing questions at him from behind the camera. And he said, can I tell you something? He said, I never thought that comment about Brzezinski would ever hold any water, that it was really true, because we didn't, he said, we didn't, the CIA ran that operation, not Brzezinski. So he said, Brzezinski came up to Harvard, he said, and he said, I told him that. And he said, oh yeah, we did. We intentionally set out to we were looking for a place to lure the Russians in, and that was it. We decided it was going to be Afghanistan. And so he said, you didn't know over in Langley what we were doing at the White House, at the NSC, at the National Security Council. So we didn't want you to know. So there's here's the guy who ran it for 5 years.
Lied.
I lied right to your face.
Right to our face.
For years.
I had a way to ask him. I didn't even have to ask him about it, because that was what 5 years earlier he had brought up is the fact that we got wrong, was that we believed the interview that Brzezinski had done with the French newspaper. And it turns out that, he actually had done it, and we were right. And so is the French newspaper guy that did the interview. And so anyway, so he just shook his head. He says, I never got a whiff of it. Never got a whiff of it.
It is odd to actually encounter men at that level admitting on, we got it on film, that, that he was stunned. And I know there are a lot of people. In fact, I had an opportunity to discuss this with Ray McGovern, who's an ex-CIA guy. And he totally just did not accept the idea that Chuck Hogan didn't know about the operation. I don't think Ray McGovern may have understood Brzezinski and the way he was set up. And by the way, we've done a lot of research that was long after our books were written into what was going on inside the White House.
Is the Team B? Is it the Team B stuff?
No, that was in 1975.
Oh, okay.
That was actually when he was getting into office. Okay. And what he did, and
he pushed the Team B agenda.
Right, and the Team B agenda basically was the neocon agenda to actually try to convince everyone that the Soviets were going to cross a border in the near future. They literally prophesied, And they were going to prove to the world they were right, effectively, that the Soviets want to take over the world. So what happens in January of 1977? Brzezinski goes in to activate that exact project, and he was successful. And so that was the fulfillment. But in terms of the differences between the CIA guys themselves, where they don't necessarily know things, because it is everyone is only a need to know basis. No matter how high up the food chain you are, you don't get information unless you need to know it. So it's hard to believe, though, when these guys who are running the operation at the top can be cut out. But as I said,
well, that's what we documented in our latest books, the Valediction, Resurrection and Valediction, Three Knights of Desmond. Three Knights of Desmond has the whole story laid out exactly how they did it, who they did it with. There was an ambassador from the United States, Adolph Dubs, who was sacrificed in order to make it happen. Adolph Dubs was a professional diplomat. He was a tough guy. He'd been a Marine Corps. He'd been in the Marine Corps during World War II. He was in the diplomatic corps. And he was also very much involved with the drug issue that was becoming very large at that particular time. And what was going on, of course, all the intelligence agencies around the world, they all used drugs as their means of supporting themselves without having to go to the government for additional funding. And so there was kind of a built-in corruption there, regardless of whatever intelligence agency it was. And they all banked it. That's what they said about BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, Commerce and Credit International, which was out of Pakistan, and was part of this whole setup that was going on at the time, starting in the mid-1970s. And so they used that bank. The Americans used it. The Saudis used it. The English used it. The French used it. And the
Israelis used it.
The Israelis used it, exactly. And it was like that was your bank that you would go to in order to negotiate these sensitive transactions, as it were. So that was going on, and that was happened. Now, you're probably aware of the fact in the 1970s, the investigations that went on about the CIA's dirty tricks and activities from the 1950s and 60s. And so they went, instead of what they did was they took these things that they had done and they privatized it. But the process of that privatization occurred during that time period, from 1976 on. So Carter, you have to really look at Carter. Carter was put in there. He was a David Rockefeller appointee, essentially. And Brzezinski was there to mind him, to make sure that he did all the right things. In fact, Brzezinski had found Carter, recommended him to David Rockefeller, and David Rockefeller had said, okay, fine, we'll support Carter if you go in there with him. So he set himself up in an office opposite the White House, opposite the president's office in the White House, and anybody that would go in to indoctrinate Jimmy Carter and a story that was a little different from what he wanted him done with, he would barge right into the meeting and sit down and take part in it, and unabashedly. And so it was really Brzezinski running certainly the foreign policy of the United States during that time period. But there was a group that they outsourced this thing in Afghanistan, in which the U.S. ambassador got caught up in, which was done by this thing called the Safari Club.
Well, this was actually 9 months before the Soviet invasion. So
I think he's got a question too.
Oh, yeah.
No. I was following along. Like, yeah, I know the Safari Club. I'm sorry.
This is the web of intrigue that you're dealing with here. This is a great spy novel, right?
But what's important to realize, though, is that when you pull back and look at what happened with Ambassador Adolph Dubs and his eventual assassination. We call it an assassination. That was as important as JFK's, but nobody knew his name. It changed the world because that's what really set up the Soviet invasion possibility. He was the one who wanted to actually try and stop the Soviets from needing to enter. And so he was up against Brzezinski. Totally.
He was there to keep them out, and Brzezinski was trying to keep them to get them in.
And February 14th, 1979, he ends up dead. And 9 months later, the Soviets were forced in because of the destabilization that Brzezinski had started in January, by the way, of 2007,
No, 1977.
1970,
Right.
1977, right.
There you
I'm getting
I know. We've been at this too long. The years start to.
So, I want to quote a couple things out of your book because I make sure that we want to. I'd like to cover like some of like a little bit more contemporary things as well. You write in your book that between 1994 and 1996, the USA supported the Taliban politically through its allies, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, essentially because Washington viewed the Taliban as anti-Iranian, anti-Shia, and pro-Western. You also say that the CIA sponsored and protected the radical Islamists that bombed the World Trade Center in 1993. My broad question is, how did the events post-Soviet invasion and the U.S. influence affect the timeline leading up to 9/11? Because I think for an interview on Afghanistan, we have to talk about like the 9/11 issue before we jump in.
No question about it. Now, the fact is that, the Al-Qaeda was the base,
Right,
by which they drew all of these fighters, against the Soviet Union into Afghanistan. And that had been in the works. That was actually a British policy. And this is where Britain is so important. Britain, from what I understand, is really the main driving wheel behind what's going on in Ukraine right now. So you've got the British telling, Zelensky one thing, and you've got, the Trump people telling him something else.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I the entire time I was reading about the Soviet situation in Afghanistan, I couldn't help but compare it to the Ukrainian situation in terms of, sure, one side invaded the other side, and that's obviously bad. We don't want this type of like warfare, but also there was a lot of circumstances leading up to it that kind of set the stage for such a thing to happen. And maybe that invasion was desired and certain things were done to provide an impetus for that. Like the similarities are pretty stark when I was reading through your book. It was very hard to avoid that comparison.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the fact is that there were a lot of people inside the CIA that did not agree with this policy. They didn't think it was a good idea at all to empower these radical Islamists, okay? But the fact is that they had been part of British policy, as I mentioned to you before. When they went in there with the East India Company, they went and they paid off the most radical mullahs, and they had them on the payroll of the British Empire. And when we picked it up, and that's one of the things Chuck Hogan said. He said, we always worked with the British. They were always very cooperative and gave us whatever we wanted or gave us information, whatever we needed. But the fact is that the British had their own agenda, and they had an agenda that went back to 1066. And I mean, that's how we inevitably got into the whole nature. I did my own family history, and I start looking into the nature of the Fitzgeralds from that part of Ireland, where the Earls of Desmond were. There was an Earl of Desmond castle right down the street from my grandfather's farm. And it's in ruins, needless to say. It's been in ruins for 400 years because of the English, specifically, and because of the Elizabethans.
Hey, my first name's Patrick, so you know what I mean. I'm very much in line with the.
I am half Indian.
I'm talking about, yeah. And so,
I get it.
Yeah, I mean, it's real. I was listening to it, and it's still going, and it's alive. Let me put it that way. Americans don't think in these terms, but I was listening to Matt Taibbi and Walter Kern talking in their weekly conversation that they have, and Walter Kern was talking about the English, and he said, he'd gone over, I think Oxford or Cambridge, and he got a degree from there. That's where he got the light bulb came on in his mind about what was really going on, who was really running the world. And he said one of the guys at Oxford that was with him, he said was an Irish kid, and he said, and he just disappeared for 2 weeks, and he said he showed up, and he said, "Where you been?" And he said, "Oh, you don't know what it's like to be Irish in England these days." He said, "They just pick you up off the street and they decide that, you're suspicious. You're a suspicion again. Your friends, they found a friend that you had when you went to school and they don't know. They want to find out, make sure that, you're not active in the resistance and da-da-da-da-da-da-da." So it's still an ongoing thing that they're doing. In fact, I believe years ago, back in the 1970s, the British had this thing in Northern Ireland where they called it a Clockwork Orange. And they made some very interesting, there was some stuff that was revealed about it. They tried to overthrow Wilson back in the 1970s. That was the plot, to overthrow Wilson by their own intelligence people. And in fact, they called the guy, they said, one of the people that was in charge of it in Northern Ireland, he was a Northern Ireland policeman, and he said, the danger, he said, is that you put out the propaganda that they're going to do something as a justification for what it is you want to do.
Right.
And he said, and then it comes back around. And he said, the people in the system, 99% of them start believing your own propaganda. So he said, that's when it gets really crazy. And that's what happened on 9/11. They got so much involved with that kind of system between the Mossad and between British intelligence and rogue elements of the CIA. I mean, Carter went in and fired a whole bunch of people at the CIA. They went right to the Safari Club. They went right out of Langley and they went right into the Safari Club and helped cook this thing up. There was a couple of guys that came out of British intelligence. I just happened to pull this out, thinking that you might be interested in this. It's Alexander Bennigsen and Bernard Lewis. If you want to do a deep dive into where this thing behind 9/11 is coming from, they're the British guys. They were working with British intelligence before they got brought on during the years of the Afghan jihad, because they were the inspiration of it. They wanted to cook up. They had this whole philosophical ethnic approach. In fact, when we spoke with Warnke, we went back and talked to Paul Warnke years later. And he said, what we had developed during that time period, he said, was an ethnic foreign policy. He said, we'd stopped trying to be or appear to be middle of the road. What we did was we picked up all these people who had these ideological directives that were from Eastern Europe, the Poles, the Czechs, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Finns. We talked to a Finn once, and the Finn said, "Oh, my father always said we fight the Germans for business and the Russians for pleasure." That's the attitude. We're not supposed to have that in the United States, right? We're supposed to have this thing that looks at it. I mean, back in the 60s, it was McNamara and his whiz kids, doing it mathematically. How many bombs do we have to drop on Vietnam to get the results we got in Europe? And, and in fact, he even says that in the documentary he made. He said he had asked Curtis LeMay when they were going to win the war in Japan.
Demon LeMay.
Yeah, bombs away LeMay. And he said, he said he was an assistant to Curtis LeMay. And so he said, he said, count up the number of gallons of gasoline it's going to take to drop on Japan and how many miles we have to, how many bombers we need to drop the gasoline, and we burn it to the ground. He said, that's when the war will be over.
He also said, if we lost, we would be considered war criminals. Right. And honestly, they still should be considered war criminals.
Win or lose.
That should not matter.
Well, the interesting thing about that, too, is that Roger Fisher, the Harvard Law School professor from Getting to Yes, we brought him. We asked him. He went to our first presentation of the documentary about what we'd seen in Afghanistan in 1981. And Theodore Elliott had come to that event as well. It was at the Parker House Hotel in the ballroom. And so Theodore Elliott started standing up. He had been an ambassador to Afghanistan. He was one of these old Brahmins. Ancestors were, judges at the witch trials in Salem. Classic.
Hated Fitzgerald.
Hated Fitzgerald. Hated the Irish.
Anti-Irish
I couldn't get away from. Let me put it that way. I couldn't get away from it. From being a Fitzgerald. Wherever I went, it's like, oh, you're one of them. Yeah. And so anyway, he started. People started asking me questions. The Time correspondent, Newsweek, Time magazine would ask me questions, and he'd stand up. He's 7 feet tall. He'd stand up from the audience and start answering the question about what was going on in Afghanistan. And so I finally said, and then he turns to me and he said, "You're treading very closely to being a conduit for Soviet propaganda." And everyone in the audience gasped. Because, here we are, we're representing the free speech of the United States.
This is 1981.
And
People did believe in it.
And here's this guy who just went to find out what's really going on because nobody else can get in there. Time Magazine can't get in. The New York Times can't get in. CBS News can't get in. But Paul and Liz got in. So we want to hear what they have to say. And this guy is saying, you're not allowed to hear that. And so I just gave the audience a little lecture about the McCarthy era and how suppression of free speech was a problem, created a problem that, has hung over American journalism for 30 years, And so at that point, I got it. They all stood up and gave me a standing ovation, and he slumped into his chair.
There you
And
go.
he's still running the world.
So that was when Roger Fisher, who was there as well, came right over, and he was running the Harvard Negotiation Project and said, "You're doing exactly what I want the Harvard Negotiation Project to do." So at any rate, when the time came and I said, "Would you be interested in going back with us?" This is 2 years later. And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you think they'd let me?" And I said, "Oh, they probably would." And the fact is that, and then of course we get there for 3 or 4 days and he looks at me and he goes, "How do you know how to do this?" And the same question you'd ask, why did we have this kind of sympathy? And I said, that was probably it, because we simply empathized with people who were voiceless in this situation. They didn't have a voice to express their willingness. We never dealt with the Russians. We always dealt with the Afghans. And they were very honest and genuine. They had nothing to lose by talking to us, and we let them understand that. So, their story was really, Afghan civilization was ancient. All that. The truth is, I remember Joe Biden making some comment about getting the U.S. troops out of Afghanistan and talking about that eastern part of Afghanistan, that's all Pakistan. Well, I heard it and I went, oh my God, it's that bad, because the fact is that eastern part that's Pakistan was Afghanistan back before the British invaded,
Right.
and wouldn't give it
Durand
back.
line,
When the British left, they said, "No, we're not in charge here anymore." They took that area, all the way from Afghanistan, all the way over to over the Hindu Kush, all the way to the river. That was all. That was Afghanistan's access to the sea, and the British, knowingly, being strategic thinkers, cut that off, so that the Russians couldn't get through Afghanistan, make a deal with the Afghans or the Germans either. That was another thing that, we didn't even have time to deal with really too much in the book, was the fact that the Germans were very aggressive in World War I to try to use Afghanistan and make an allegiance with the Afghans in order to invade
India.
the colony India. Yeah. So you've got this incredible combination. And of course, it goes back to Alexander the Great tried doing it. It didn't work out too well for him either.
No.
So, you've got this incredible background history of this stuff going on, and the personalities involved, and the nations involved. We became a country and a nation in 1776, and these people are going. You're talking, thousands of years of culture right in the city itself. The wall that goes up over the hill. I said to our friend at the embassy, I said, I took pictures of that we took extensive pictures of the city and that wall that goes back hundreds of years. And he shook his head. He mean thousands of years. Mm-hmm. So, it's like, oh, excuse me. I learned something new every time I went there and I talked to these people. But there is something about the place that I have to admit, it's a magic place. There is a sense when you set foot on the ground there. I don't know what it is, and other people have said the same thing about that, and some other places in the area. There's something unusual about it. It's kind of like going into St. Patrick's Cathedral, or going into the Vatican, or going into
sacred ground.
The mosque in Istanbul, in Turkey. When you get there, it's like there's something happening here, which was originally built, by the way, as a Catholic church, as a Christian church. So, so it's there. It is an extension, and of course, it's the extension of our own global interconnection with everyone else. It's what we share with everyone else. And the idea being that we shouldn't be dropping bombs on them. We should be talking to them about this incredible place we live in, this opportunity that we have to be together.
So I know we only have a few minutes left here, and I just wanted to get one more question in because obviously you published this book in 2009, correct? So there's obviously been a lot of events in Afghanistan since the release of this book. I know in your book you say that one senior Afghan cabinet member told you when you were there that if international forces, this is during the occupation, the United States occupation, if international forces leave, the Taliban will take over in an hour. And that Afghan cabinet member was dead on the money with how the situation transpired. Obviously, we have Donald Trump organizing the negotiation with the Taliban, and then Joe Biden actioning it and everything from there. Just for the last couple of minutes of this interview, with all the events that occurred after the book was published, what do you think is important for people to know about Afghanistan from after the publishing of the book?
Well, this is something we had to explain to Seema Wali, our Afghan partner and friend, who was the first refugee to come to this country in 1978, hosted by Theodore Elliott, by the way, the ambassador. And what we had to explain to her when we first met her in 1998, she said, after 10 years, the Soviets have gone. Why is it worse in Afghanistan? This was before the rise of the Taliban. This would have been in 1998. And we had to tell her, your country was never meant to be saved. It was never meant to be given back to you. You know, this is the truth, okay? And the Taliban, in fact, Chuck Kogan referred to the Taliban of a wholly owned subsidiary of Pakistani intelligence. And Pakistani intelligence was created by British intelligence. And when you begin to see the pan-Islamism of the British agenda from the 19th century is still living in some of these systems, okay? And it was very alive in Pakistan during the Afghan operation. That was definitely the place where the entire, for instance, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who received the largest amount of money from the CIA, he was an Afghan who went over to the Pakistan and began working with the intelligence people. And it was well known, that he killed a lot more moderate Afghans than he killed any Soviets or any communists. It was actually the ones they really were afraid of were the ones who would appeal to the people and who they couldn't get rid of. They did not want the king back in when after the Afghan, once the invasion was over in Afghanistan in 2002, when they had their Berlin meeting. They made sure that the Afghans did not get the king back. If that's who they wanted, that they had a Loya Jirga, and that's who they voted for. And Zalmay Khalilzad, who was a well-known Afghan that had been working out of the University of Chicago with the United States. He was clearly a neocon, and he was in on the neocon agenda. So you can't be fooled by the fact that he happened to be an Afghan. He made sure that the Afghan king did not come back. And they really wanted him because they wanted something to inspire the people to come together and believe.
And the only thing that was left in Afghanistan by that point was the royal family, was the king. And they kept him out intentionally, and they kept out any kind of formation like a government in exile. They stopped that from happening as well. With people, legitimate members who had a concern about how to put Afghanistan back together again.
Well, before the Soviets left, they were willing to try to help bring the king back. So the basic problem that we have to realize is that these people don't end up in charge accidentally. The Taliban was no accident at all. The horrible outcome was not just for Afghan women; it was for all the Afghan people, and it represents, I think, the crisis that we see in many countries around the world. But we felt that in Afghanistan's case, there had been so much that had really stayed alive in Afghanistan because they never were completely taken over by the British Empire. That was not the case in many other places. So it was a very special place that they finally turned inside out. And the British were definitely a part of that operation.
And they still are.
US,
and they still are. So you really have to, what's old is new. And,
right.
and what's new is old. They're just bringing it forward from the past. And as Michael Parenti used to say, he said, just because you don't think they're doing it doesn't mean they don't think they're doing it. So, yeah.
Shout out Michael Parenti, one of our absolute favorites.
If I could just add
Go
one
ahead, John.
thing really
Go ahead,
quick
John.
at the end, and I'm gonna kind of like dedicate this to, my good friend, Allah Yarhamo, right, Rashad, Jayun. He was from Kabul, right? Of course, like, he was more, akin to saying that he was from New York than anything else, but like, he was from Kabul, Afghanistan, with his entire family, came over here in the 90s, right? And like, I don't think it really should need someone to have like that personal connection, to have that sort of human empathy that you describe, right?
Yeah.
And like, honestly, like, why we call our show like Subversive History, there is a historical record, and it's really not that hard to find, right? Whether you're looking at like an interview of Brzezinski or Hogan, right, having an interview in another language, like, a lot of times, like, they'll be very open about the things that they're saying. It just might not be in English, and it might require just like a little bit of effort, right, for you to listen to people outside of like where you are from, right? Whether you are talking about the plight of the people of Afghanistan that have fled to Iran, or we're looking at like, news stories of, people in the Israeli government speaking in Hebrew instead of English, or we are talking about like the aims, right, of British colonialism, American imperialism, right? A lot of times, like, the information is there. You just need to like dig a little deeper. And I could not be more grateful to have a team of you two, right, like, doing this excellent and amazing work, and shining a light on the people of Afghanistan that, like, have had to put up with so many other people for so many centuries at this point, like, sticking their finger into like the business of how these people decide to live their lives, and also like discrediting like, my religion, right, Islam, and trying to make it appear as if like, it's not a religion that is one of hospitality, one of humility, one of humanity, right? That like the English and other like, colonialist powers have twisted it into, right? So thank you again so much for all of your hard work and coming onto our show.
Thank you again for inviting us. It's a wonderful opportunity. We'd be glad to come back anytime you'd like, and fill out the details. There's a lot we need to do, and I think just as a parting glance, I'd say that we really, the American people. We've done a number of book tours, and it is shocking. The audiences. We were well received everywhere we went. Especially, we'd get people. I'd see people sitting in their seats, kind of squirming around, and it would turn out to be somebody who worked for the United States government, who'd been in a country and had said, "Why don't we get the right story out? About what's really about these people, who they really are." So you have a lot of very sincere, dedicated people who went into the Foreign Service with the right intentions, to really, to help people. And certainly we went in with the right intentions, but then you get in there and you discover that the ones who are directing the narrative are doing it for very specific reasons. And we can see what the reasons are now. And, we're living in an era of revelation, you might say, and let's hope we don't get the apocalypse, but apocalypse is another word for revelation. So I guess you have to accept the fact that, you're going to be a little shocked at all the things you didn't get to know along the way. And so at any rate, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. And thank you for everything that you have done. And maybe we'll grab Crossing Zero. We'll read that and we'll reach back out and have a conversation about that one.
You might consider also the valediction books, because you go into the whole thing with Adolf Dubs is in the valediction, 3 Nights of Death. That's really
we will absolutely check it out. We're huge fans of your work and everything that you've done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Afghanistan Zindabad.
So don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. Don't treat them like that. It's USSR. PLO style, PLO style got thrown out the car. Rise for subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Rise for subversive plots. Red radical. And fight them. Capitalism and democracy. Capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We group us up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread